you catch a reviewer's eye? What is the state of cookbook publishing today? Do writers and editors rely too much on what we like to call recipe speak? We'll talk all about that and so much more on this week's episode. Welcome to Everything Cookbooks, the podcast for writers, readers, and cooks. I'm Kate Leahy, and today my co-host Molly Stevens and I are going to get into the nitty-gritty on what makes a cookbook stand out. Molly, I have a question for you.
Yes, Kate?
If I asked you to name the biggest changes in cookbooks in recent years, what comes to mind?
Well, other than dust jackets going the way of the dodo.
Oh, dust jackets. Oh, the poor old dust jacket.
I still miss dust jackets. No, that was a while ago. But I think the biggest thing that I noticed, and it's certainly from a lot of our guests on this podcast, but it's rule breaking. That it seems to me that when I started out, there was a certain way to write a recipe, and that's how recipe. And I'm not saying recipe speak. It wasn't Happy Robot Voice necessarily, but recipes were somewhat standardized. And I think that we're finding more and more creative ways to write recipes and to create cookbooks. I mean, that's the other thing, that just the way cookbooks go from idea to production, we thought we knew how it happens. And time and time again, Kate, our guests surprise us, right?
It's so true. And I think it took me so long to learn the rules that it's taken me a while to realize you can break them too.
Right.
So I think that's the tricky balance, right? You kind of have to know the rules before you break them, or maybe you don't anymore. I don't know.
I think it's an exciting time in cookbooks. I really do.
I think you're right too. That's why I think we have so much meaty business to talk about with our guest today, who is Bonnie Benwick. Bonnie worked as a journalist for 39 years, spending the majority of her career at the Washington Post. She retired as the deputy editor of the newspaper's food section, and over the course of her career, she read, she wrote about, and she reviewed a lot of cookbooks, which is one of the reasons we can't wait to see what changes that she's seen over the years in cookbooks. She also wrote the Washington Post's first cookbook, which came out in 2013. And I mean, over her career, she's won pretty much like all the awards.
One of each, yes, some of all of them.
And today she works as a freelance editor and writer focusing on cookbook production. In other words, I think we've got a ton to talk about. So with no further ado, let's get into it. Bonnie Benwick, welcome to Everything Cookbooks.
Hi, everybody.
So we thought we'd start our conversation today talking a little bit about your time at the Washington Post. And we want to know, what it was like when you first started at the food section. Was that back in 2004? What was the food section like back then?
I had actually been at the Post part-time and then full-time since 1989, so it took me a while to get in there. The food section was very small, 5 or 6 people, including a part-time assistant, and very closely held. And through a series of no less than 5 buyouts through those sort of leaner Washington Post years, I was able to finally get my foot in the door. When I started, of course, the rest of the staff was pretty skeptical, like, who the heck is she?
Oh,
because you weren't in food before that.
Well, in my previous food and features experience actually went back to 1981. I started at this local suburban newspaper. I learned from the great late Jane Mengenhauser, who was the food editor there, how to proofread a recipe. And we used to have to code them to feed them into a computer. And that was like a whole other deal where all of a sudden the type would come out in 84-point type and stuff like that. When people were still pasting up the newspaper.
Yep.
I'm a dinosaur. My kids were small and I wanted to work part-time and at night, and the food section I didn't go after it right away. So when I finally did get there, I'd been fairly far removed from the food business, but always reading everything I could in terms of media and magazines and cookbooks. And I'm that person who says, yes, they're on my bedside table. I do. I actually do.
Yep.
They were skeptical. And the very first story that I wrote was, I think, about orange juice or something. And I quoted somebody a writer on staff was not very happy with. And it blew up right away. It took me a while to sort of fit in to the small group. And then through attrition, I think almost everybody on staff who was originally there when I started there ended up leaving for various reasons. When I got to the food section, it was pages and pages and pages. There weren't circulars inserted into the newspaper. All the ads were actually in the section. So the section was this meaty, beefy 12, 14, 16-page thing.
Whoa,
and with almost no pictures inside. I mean,
Wow.
there was no studio, no test kitchen. You know, it was an old building. They used to hire a freelance photographer who was off-site and a stylist to do like the cover, whatever the feature was that happened to do with food that week. And the rest of it was just literally inside column inches of recipes that sort of went from the bottom to the top.
Mm-hmm.
I was doing layout at the time, and so you couldn't really put a recipe against an ad because people were still cutting them out, you know?
Oh, wow.
Right.
Yeah. So I think one of the first things that I wanted to do was make it a more visual section. Food is visual, right?
Right.
Yep.
So we carved out a studio in the basement of the annexed building next door. And there was no photographer on staff who was used to shooting food or really knew how to do it. So we started hiring different freelancers. There wasn't an oven. There wasn't a refrigerator. I was working out of a cooler. I mean, it was all kind of very bare bones. And when I looked, some of those photos still exist in the Washington Post recipe finder, I'm sorry to say, and they don't look very good. I'm not proud, but...
Well, it was the frontier.
Yeah.
It was.
Right.
It was. But, you know, other people were doing better things.
What was the website like?
So the WashingtonPost.com sort of got created separately from the Washington Post, and it was a kind of a unionized thing, and it was literally physically across the river from the main building. So there was this pioneer food person. I don't know if you know Kim O'Donnell. She was way out there. She had an online chat. She was very much into, you know, vegetable forward foods even then. And she would have recipes, but we really didn't have a lot to do with her. And then we started our own chat. So very early on, we were doing a weekly chat with lots of readers. But again, it wasn't a visual thing, and it certainly didn't have video or any of the other components that you would expect today.
Yeah, it's funny. I think about the food section, and you're talking about recipes, but there's also food journalism coverage that's part of it too. Is that now what we expect, whereas originally it was more of a lifestyle recipe? That's what you would find in the food section.
Well, you know, ironically enough, I think it's sort of switched on his head. There was a very good consumer affairs reporter in the food section, Carol Sugarman, who's local, and she was right on it. And we also had a food scientist, Dr. Robert Wolke.
Oh, he's written those great books.
That's right. So I had the privilege of editing him, and he had a weekly Q&A column. You know, we had features about local chefs and local home cooks and what was going on in the other food sections, you know, in a way that now I think the section started just before I left. And now the primary focus really seems to be in teaching people basics and getting everybody sort of up to speed and making things easy and accessible.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because I think during this time, it was also kind of a pivotal time in food sections and papers all across the country. I mean, we were seeing them closing down, being shuttered. And yet the Washington Post seemed to be growing, becoming one of the ones that was going to stick around and be a robust food section.
Right, because I remember you would have the Chicago Tribune, the food sections kept getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Then everything was syndicated. And that test kitchen was kind of like a mothballed fleet because it was just like there was like one person there left at the end.
Yeah, it was kind of surprising how few newspapers, by the time I got around to doing a test kitchen in the new building that we moved to after Bezos bought the Post, we moved into rented quarters and we got to design and put in a test kitchen then. But I was kind of surprised at how few papers really had one. I don't think the New York Times had one when we got started, although theirs is pretty spectacular now.
Right. Interesting.
You were at the Post and you helped build it, and then you became the deputy editor. What was that job like?
Well, the staff remained fairly small, so I was really responsible for running the test kitchen and for writing a weekly Dinner in Minutes column, it was called. And that was another thing I sort of changed. It had been called various things, but mostly, I think, since the 80s, something called Dinner Tonight. It was on the first page when you opened it up. It was designed to be a 30-minute meal a la sort of Rachel Ray. And the recipes came from everywhere. But I rewrote those recipes, just that one. I would rewrite in real time so that you didn't do all the mise en place, you know, you weren't chopping ahead of time. Because I think that's the way people really cook during the week. Mm-hmm. While something's going on the stove, that's when you're chopping up the next thing. you're creating a sauce, you're heating up water to make broth, or you're defrosting something while something's on, in the oven. So I tried to rewrite them that way. And I think that was helpful for people. I did that for about 12 years. And I was responsible for running the test kitchen, inventorying, ordering things, laundry, took home laundry.
Oh my goodness, right?
Yeah.
Somebody's got to do the towels and the aprons.
That's right. And also for managing volunteer testers. We had, I think at one time, maybe 35 testers, both inside the building and outside.
Wow.
That was really valuable to me, especially for the people who were home cooks, not just reporters and editors and staffers at the Post, but people out there, because they would tell me, I can't find this, or what did you mean by that? It's the same sort of feedback that you guys get when you have your cookbook recipe tested by other people.
Yeah. Speaking of cookbooks, so cookbooks certainly evolved during your time at the Post and since then. And I'm curious about the coverage of cookbooks while you were at the Post, how that might have changed.
It changed a lot.
Yeah.
And it's changed since. Because I was deputy editor, I really wanted to bring them more into view. So used to be, I think the section would do kind of that end of the year, here are the gift cookbooks you can give to Aunt Sally and whatever, with a big bow on top, a stack of books. It's that shot that you can almost picture in your head.
Oh, yeah.
But then I wanted to do individual cookbook reviews. And I think for me, I'm missing these days actual cookbook criticism. There's not that much of it around for the general public. I mean, if you're interested in cookbooks, you can go to Paula Forbes, but those little blurbs that appear in food magazines these days, or online, or people's reviews on Amazon, you don't know where they really came from. I don't tend to get a lot out of that. And I think there's a tendency, and certainly I'm guilty of this, I know how much work goes into a cookbook. And so I'm hesitant to say, boy, this cookbook really missed the mark. But there are just things about it that could be better or more helpful, or reach certain readers that you think that this is, who this is meant for. And so I'm missing in the general media that sort of commentary.
Right.
It's like you see more in fiction reviews and nonfiction reviews.
It's true. And I think that's something that Andrea has talked about on this podcast. It's like, where is the criticism? Why can't cookbooks be treated or given that rigor that, say, a novel will be given, or a different work of nonfiction? There's something about, like, we're very nice, which is, it's good to be nice, but it's also, maybe it's like this small community, and you don't want to kick somebody who you might be asking for a blurb from later on, which is the truth sometimes, I think.
Yeah. I would dive into a cookbook. I would test 5 to 7 recipes, which is probably a couple more than some people were doing at the time. And then for those seasonal roundups, I sort of increased those from 1 to 3. I did fall, winter, spring, summer, with maybe like an extra roundup of grilling books or something seasonal. And in those, I would not limit it to a top 10, which I thought was kind of an artificial artifice. And, who's top 10? So it got to be probably for some people an unwieldy list. I would review as many as 20 and put them into categories of baking, so that the baking wasn't just a baking book for beginners, but also a baking book for somebody a little more advanced or adventurous, or somebody using alternative flours, or local authors. I always tried to put in a couple of those. So that was the goal. And I think that that's missing a little bit these days from a lot of the general media that I find. But if you want to find out about a cookbook, you can certainly Google it. But again, I'm not quite sure what you're getting in terms of that experienced and knowledge hand who's actually gone through the book.
Speaking of reviews, we have to ask you, this is just probably one of the best articles I've read just about what it takes to really think of a cookbook and where it fits in the market. And it's very fair, I think, as well. But let's talk about your review about the Magnolia Table. This is an article that came out the beginning of 2019 from a book that came out in 2018. The title is, Why Did Food Media Ignore the Best-Selling Cookbook of 2018? And before we ask you about it, I have to read part of the intro. I was always keen to survey the cookbook realm, wondering whether the food media's best of list reflects what the American public craves. I thought I had a handle on what the most popular cookbook would be, but I was Marco Polo off. ice cold wrong. I mean, that is such a gripping opener. Tell us a little bit about how that idea came to write this piece, because I think it balances, here's what food people think is cool versus like, what are Americans really wanting to cook at home?
There seemed to me to be, there's always an inordinate amount of TV personalities who can sell more cookbooks than anybody else. And whether or not that's justified, I mean, I know a lot of people who will never be on television who've written unbelievably wonderful cookbooks, you all included. So when I started looking for numbers and talking to a couple of publishing houses, it was a no-brainer. I think I was fairly new to Instagram at the time. There was what I think is now a concerted marketing effort for Magnolia Table. There were people who were just gushing over these recipes. And you all know that you can read a recipe and know that it's got maybe 3 times as much fat as it needs, or it's not going to be very healthy, or it's not going to work for various reasons. You sort of pick up on that after you've read a couple of thousand recipes. So I was a little stumped at why this was so popular. I actually tracked down and got in touch with a couple of people that had posted on Instagram and asking them specifically, sort of in a nice way, how many recipes they tried in the book. And I got into the conversation with them, and they would say things like, well, I think it was my fault because, it blew up in the oven, or it overflowed, and I should have put a pan underneath. I'm like, is that what's wrong with that recipe? Operator error? I don't know, So then I just started testing my way through, and I tested, I think, like 20 or something.
Whoa. We
did them all at the Post, and I had people eat them because it was part of the, if you put cheese and breadcrumbs and bacon and, all the things that are full of umami and deliciousness in one thing, potatoes, and, put it all in a casserole and bake it until it's golden brown and bubbling and delicious, who's not going to like that? And still, we found people who were like, I don't know, like I couldn't eat more than a bite of this. And so, again, it was that thing where it was wildly popular, but I waited until a lot of the lists came out, because they usually came out before the Washington Post published its own cookbook list for the end of the year. And they weren't listed, I think they were listed in 1 or 2, but clearly they sold, I don't know, a couple of million. And then she had another book that was already out. The book actually, I think, had come out before the restaurant had opened. And so it seemed to me that maybe it was part of the commercialization or marketing for the restaurant, that they'd have the T-shirts and the hats and the tote bags and the book, right there for people to buy. But I'm being very cynical.
It's really interesting because we write books because we take it pretty seriously that people are going to take these books into their homes and cook from them and want to have success from them. And that thing about you could take one bite and it might be tasty, but you couldn't imagine eating a whole serving. That's something I think about all the time when I'm recipe testing, because if it's meant to be a dinner, you want to be able to eat the whole thing. But this notion that what's the target for the book? What's the objective for the book? Or is it a piece of an overall marketing strategy? We talk about success, like what makes success in a cookbook. And if it's only numbers, well, I don't even know why I'm sitting here talking, because I don't know anything, right? I mean, we all want our books to sell. But anyway, that's why I think that article is so interesting. I'm not being very articulate, but it's so interesting because one of the best-selling cookbooks of the year is not necessarily the critically most acclaimed, the best written, the most tested. We talked to Charlotte Druckmann about cookbook awards.
Yeah, she knows her stuff.
Yeah. And in so many cases, the books that win awards aren't commercial successes, and some of the best reviewed books are not necessarily commercial successes. So it's this challenge of how books get recognized and what they get recognized for. One of the things Charlotte said and I was listening to you talk about cookbook criticism and this question about whether awards and or criticism are ever truly objective, or should they be? Because every cookbook is not written for every person.
True.
So for me to say this is the best baking book of this year, it's like, well, for who? Right?
Right. But I will say the Magnolia Cookbook was appealing as a lifestyle more than the mere fact of its recipes. It held the promise of all American family value. I'm not saying that in a bad way at all, the kind of casserole-y, invite the neighborhood over and it makes a whole sheet pan full kind of recipes, breakfast and brunch and hearty things like that. But to me, it just wasn't working as a cookbook. And yet, I had to admit a certain amount of snobbery on my part. I used to pay attention to when they were dinging Paula Deen for a number of things, including that everything had a stick of butter. Mm-hmm. It was kind of a joke, but it helped propel her in a way. It's that farm-friendly, America loves dairy. It just hit on a whole bunch of things. And there was definitely a lifestyle aspect. They already had a massive built-in audience. And as you can see, the Empire, I am now watching Magnolia Television cooking shows. I mean, they've really expanded to some very interesting things. I mean, the Lost Kitchen show, there's another chef that I see on that, and Zoe Francois is on that. I'm not saying that whatever they're selling is bad at all or is meant for a certain part of the population. It had wide appeal, but at the same time, none of us were really writing about it.
Right. And I think that goes back to the original point of the article, is that the food media was not talking about this book that was the best-selling cookbook of the year. Right. So there's a disconnect.
Until you wrote that article.
Yeah, it also showed them that, they don't need the food media to write about this cookbook in order for it to sell.
They are now the food media, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
No, that's very interesting. So let's talk a little bit about cookbook writing. And we mentioned that it's changed and your coverage of it while you were at the Post changed. But what are some of the big changes that you've seen in cookbook writing or production?
I've definitely seen greater exploration of national cuisines and also the niche market. Air fryer thing has calmed down a little bit. Yay! I don't have one, so that's why I'm saying yay.
I don't either. And it's like, if these books keep coming out, I'm going to have to get one so I can actually test some of these.
TV celebrity still is a strong factor, but it's not just the only thing anymore. There was a big wave of bloggers getting cookbooks if they reached a certain level of popularity in social media. But now I think those levels are maybe even a little less important. The audience that they bring to the table for a publisher is even just slightly less important than it used to be. There seems to be kind of interesting, since I'm a nuts and bolts recipe writing geek, there seems to be kind of a loosening of the format.
Absolutely.
I'm happy about that. It was either Dory Greenspan, talk you through it, be at your elbow, be friendly and happy and personable, or it was no articles in sort of Tarzan speak, I think, and that whole in a bowl put
I'm still guilty.
I know. Well, it's been beaten into us, but I will tell you that a couple of years after I took the job, Judith Jones was in town promoting her Cooking for One, her single book.
Yeah.
And I took her out to tea and I brought a stack of a dozen books with me because I'm shameless. And I just had her go through them all. And over and over again, she would just say, why do they write like this? Why can't we just write in English? And it stuck with me.
So you were having her just use her editorial eye to just sort of
I just had her flip
react.
through.
Wait, I want more details. Like, where were you having tea with Judith Jones? Like this
at the
legend?
Blue Duck Tavern in Washington, D.C. It serves afternoon tea. And we were there for a couple of hours. I mean, she was very kind to do this with me. But, I mean, the bottom line is I think we don't give people enough credit that they'll be able to read through the whole sentence to see what kind of bowl or spoon they need. I mean, a long time ago, we didn't write recipes in America and tell you that you needed a bowl at all because they figured you had a bowl. You might have just had one bowl, but you had a bowl, and now it's like...
So you could just say combine the milk and eggs. You're not going to say in a bowl because where else are you going to do it? In your hands?
Exactly,
right?
exactly.
And to clarify for listeners, this is what the recipes speak, that it's like in a bowl, stir together the butter and the sugar.
You say utensil, action, ingredients. In a bowl, put eggs and butter.
In the bowl of a stand mixer or handheld electric mixer fitted
bowl
with a wire whisk attachment, comma. Like, I'm tired already.
And I actually have a question. I have a hardest time when it comes to like in a medium saucepan over medium heat, heat the oil. Like that to me is like crazy, but then sometimes you get stuck because you have to use it. What should we be doing instead?
Oh, we might have to do another show.
I think so. Yeah. I know. That could go down a rabbit hole.
But I love this tea with Judith because, Kate, I want to do an episode where we just get a bunch of books and go through them and look and react without identifying names.
That would be awesome.
But there are so many, and this is going back to, Bonnie, what you were saying about one of the things that's changed and we've certainly noticed it, is this freeing of recipe style. And you mentioned before, one of the things you did when you were at the Post, you were embedding the timeline, kind of shaking it up. So you're not going to say in the ingredient list, 2 cups of chopped onions, all these things, all this work wasn't going to be hidden. Right. It was going to be laid out. So you could be chopping the onions while you're heating the oil.
People used to say, this doesn't take 30 minutes. It takes me 30 minutes just to chop all the things for the recipe. I'm like, no, it doesn't. If you do it like you would do. I mean, I'm part of a cookbook club since I retired. They let me in. And one of the books was Allie Slagle. And there was a fairly 50-50 split among the group about how she wrote those recipes, which was... in a different style. You guys have had her on, right?
Yeah, those instructions are so abbreviated.
Yes.
And she's very clear that her audience knows how to cook.
She's just listing ingredients, not telling you how much, so that you actually have to read the recipe as you go along. A little bit Joy of Cooking, that sort of narrative style of, we're not going to tell you a minute before you need to use it sort of thing. So somewhere in the middle, I think, is where I'm most comfortable.
What was the feedback like in your cookbook club?
I think they were so used to seeing the measurements because they wanted to know. Some people use an ingredient list to go shopping, basically.
Oh, sure.
And that would also inform sometimes when I would write a recipe or when somebody like Molly would freelance for us. When I was going over things, I would say, instead of a half a cup of chopped onion, I'd say like half a medium onion or half a 4-ounce onion or something like that, because I'm not buying chopped onions. I'm buying the onion to chop up. Things like that. I mean, it's the nitty gritty stuff that I care about, unfortunately. So.
Yeah, the nitty gritty stuff can really, it can trip you up because nowadays too, sometimes with like, when it comes to garlic cloves in my area in San Francisco have just become enormous. I don't know if that's other parts of the country. So when it's like one garlic clove in a recipe that I would have written 5 years ago, it's like, well, this garlic clove. But then also I hear from people buying like pre-frozen cubes of minced garlic. And it says on the little container that it's 1 equals 1 clove. Yeah. So, and I know a lot of people are probably thinking, I don't have to mince the garlic anymore. I'll just use these little like, frozen pellets. So it's like, it's really, all these little things. I mean, that's why I think we geek out on this podcast. We get a little wonky about this stuff, but it matters,
and
right?
Thank goodness there's a podcast like this to geek out on. Shallots, shallots are the big thing, right?
Yeah.
The size of a shallot. And what are you talking about?
What is the proper size of a shallot? I mean, you could chop a shallot and you could have like a cup or you could have a tablespoon.
Right. Some other things that I've noticed in cookbooks is there are more tips and sidebars and notes than there used to be. And a couple of cookbooks have used QR codes, which refers you to a link that's a video of whatever technique is going on. And I have kind of mixed emotions about that. I don't really want to stop in the middle of but then again, it's a book and I can put it down and everybody's visual and online these days. So why take up extra room in print that you don't really have, that costs money, if you can refer to something that's going to be online literally, almost forever. So, but all those tips and sidebars and things, I'm wondering if it makes up the difference of trying to bring in the audience that maybe isn't as confident cooking in the kitchen or doesn't know about a certain ingredient. You get to hedge your bets, but not necessarily make the recipe longer. So if it's off to the side or sidebar, I've noticed that too. And something that I think you probably mentioned on another episode, the design and layout of the books. I can't tell you how much I don't like when they just move the number of servings all over the place. Oh. It used to be right under the title. Oh, that only serves 2, so I would want to make that for dinner. Or it's at the end of the recipe, it's in the middle of the recipe, it comes after the head note, but before the ingredients. And I'm just thinking, this is just design run amok. I mean, I don't really understand why. It can be anywhere on the page, but I guess I have to get over that.
No, it's like Kate and page numbers. She gets crazy where the page numbers go. But
they travel. They really do.
They really do.
I have found myself looking and looking and looking. I'm like, why can't I figure out how many servings? it's funny because sometimes they just feel, and I don't so much object to them moving, but please let me be able to find that information. I get tripped up by, and this is an old book, but it's one of my favorite books, the Suzanne Goin.
Sunday Suppers.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. I love that book. But all the recipes, they're designed as menus. And it says way in the front of the book that all the recipes serve, I think it's 6.
Yes.
But it doesn't repeat that information, which I totally understand. But if it's been a couple months since I've looked at that book, I forget. And I'm like, oh, right. I have to go remind myself.
Yeah. Well, when you guys have done cookbooks, does anybody ever say, why don't we just say it all up front in the front material, like all the eggs are large and all the butter's unsalted? And I'm thinking, boy, if that recipe gets picked up or Xeroxed or copied or made into a PDF, I mean, who's going to know?
Yeah. Yeah.
And people don't sometimes read the fine print either. So they might just skip straight to the recipe. They don't read the front matter. So they're not going to see that note about the 6 servings or the large eggs. But, I've actually never heard anybody talk too much about the placement of the yield for recipes. And now I'm really going to go back and look to see where it's buried in books I've worked on, because that actually really does matter. Like Molly, you were saying, if you're going to make this cake and you're having people over, you might want to know if it's going to serve, and you're going to have to make 2 of those cakes, or is this one going to work, or is one going to be too much?
It's going to say what makes one 8-inch cake, and then I have to figure out how many servings you get from an 8-inch cake.
That's what it'll say.
But that's okay. That's on me. I can figure that out.
My friend Kathy Barrow, one of the first books I tested recipes for her, but then I also did a kind of a pass edit. And when she got the proofs back, I think they did have the yield. There was a title of the recipe, and there was head note, and then there was something else, and then there was a yield, and it was in the same sort of font that was right next to the word ingredients. And so it was pretty easy to skip over. For her particular book, the yield was rather important for every bagel recipe because it was part of the selling point of the book. So it just seemed like they could have made it into a thing, but, they were playing around with it. And I remember she was butting heads with them for months. Finally, she won, thank goodness. But it's a little bit like when I was at the Post, I sort of came in on a copy desk layout editor slot. And in the 90s, they started moving bylines around, even on the front page, so that in that classic newspaper fold, you could see a picture and you could read the headline, but then you were looking for the byline and it would actually come under the subhead, which was buried somewhere between the 2 columns of type or something. And it just made me a little nuts.
Can I ask you how you feel about sub-recipes and the best way to treat sub-recipes? People hate turning pages and whatnot in a recipe, but sometimes it's inevitable that you need to include maybe that little bit of vinaigrette or sauce.
These days, when I'm suggesting things like that, it sort of depends on how involved the sub-recipe is. If we're talking about a slurry, it's not really a big deal. It's a couple of ingredients and you can take care of it in a sentence. But if it's something that needs a certain amount of time, like if I have to hydrate figs overnight, I certainly want to know about that before I start even reading the recipe. It's another thing. I know you guys did a really great show on recipe head notes, particular interest of mine again. But when I was editing for the Post, I would mention if something really needed that much advance work, I would say, you're going to do this overnight and then you're going to be ready to go. Just to give people a heads up, because as you said, some people just don't read all the way through. And I find that helpful. In the most recent book that I edited, I think the editor chose to do a separate sub-recipe for the sauce or whatever beneath the main recipe. And again, I have a little bit of a problem with that because you're mentioning something before you're using the thing. So you have to go down there and make it before you can finish the rest of the recipe.
Right. So if you're doing barbecue and you have glaze you need to make for the ribs or something, and maybe the glaze you have to cook it, you don't want that to fall underneath the barbecue recipe because you need that glaze before you start. So that's a smart way to think about it. Just think of the order. Be practical. But sometimes it's hard to feel practical when you're staring at a Word document and you're not in the kitchen.
I recipe tested for ISCP last year. The book that won that sort of blew me away was this pair of Irish chefs in Dublin who run a restaurant called Michael's. They were charming and funny, but they were chef recipes. They had, some of them had 3 and 4 subcomponents. And I thought, well, normally I'm not a big fan of this, but they sort of made sense and they were pretty easy to do. And I think their sheer, the sort of writing style, it's called For the Mains. I think it won that category. But I was surprised at myself that I liked it. So there you go. I'm not consistent.
Well, I also think it depends on the expectation of the book. It's not like dinner in 6, or dinner in 30 minutes or something, and you're getting a payoff for it. But it does have to be presented right. One of the things you said earlier, Bonnie, about recipes, all the sidebars and all the tips and all that, I'm seeing that recipes are getting shorter. Mm-hmm. And there's sort of less like the whole thing about just get to the recipe, that with all the blogs and stuff. So I think some of what writers have done is pulled out information that would have been in a head note or would have been in a long method. And so it looks like a short recipe on the page.
Yes. To me, that seems like an editor thing. Somebody took a look at it and said, here's the way we're going to make it fit. Or how much is really necessary, or can we put it someplace else? I totally get that. But I'm wondering also, and you guys could answer this, does it have to do with the overall expense of the book or the number of pages that you're going to be allotted? I've seen 100 and something less is kind of the going rate over the past couple of years.
In terms of recipes in a book, yeah. And I also think it has to do with trying to appeal to different audiences. So if you have an audience that wants, I remember sitting, as you know, Bonnie, I write long. I remember sitting in the car when one of my books had just come out, and one of my family members is flipping through and going, oh, I'm never making that. Oh, I'm never making that. Because there's like 2-3 pages. And I was like, God, I'm here. I'm in the back seat.
It's so ironic. It's all pendulum swinging business. People who were shoving TV dinners into electric ovens were grasping the 4-page Julia Child cassoulet recipe in their hands saying, yes, I'm going to make this. And now we can't be bothered. We have to turn the page once. There's got to be, I don't know if it's age or.
It might be that whole attention span, that everyone's attention span with getting bombarded with so many different things, that we have a harder time focusing on just like reading 2 pages and following it and remembering and recalling. The cookbook writers, we're competing with, there's a lot to compete with. We're competing with like TikTok videos where people make things look so easy to make. Why would you have to pick up a book and read it?
You know what, though? Cookbooks to me they're so involving. They command your attention. I mean, if you're going to even think about making the thing or imagining how delicious it's going to be, you have to sort of really zero in and read it. So it's another reason why I don't understand why we have to spell out every single thing. Like I really expect the person who's into this is going to plow their way through and figure it out because the payoff is good.
That's a good point. I think it's just trusting the reader's intelligence, trusting the reader to understand what you're conveying in a recipe rather than having to over-explain. Maybe we were over-explaining in head notes, but it sounds like now it's sort of like we over-explain in method because we don't trust that people will understand us. And maybe that's okay.
Yeah, here's a particularly simple one. Stirring a few times, stirring constantly, stirring occasionally. Where do you stand on that? I mean, some people would be very happy to know exactly when and how long to stir. And other people are like, you got to be kidding me. What are you going to tell me how to breathe in and out next? I mean, and it's not that I want to write a cookbook for everybody. I don't expect everybody to love any particular kind of cookbook. But I'm struck by that. And I think it's one of the things, again, where I don't know if it's there or not there because of the cost involved in the printing of the thing, or it's the appetite of the certain readers who don't want too many words, or if they've had, market research studies done that said nobody wants to see that same phrase again and again. I don't know.
Stir to combine. How about just combine?
Or the preheat the oven versus heat the oven. Molly, I know that's
toss gently, as opposed to throw it against the wall. I mean,
and if you're in the UK and you say toss, it means a completely different thing.
That is funny.
Yeah.
Bonnie, let's jump ahead and talk about what you're working on now. I understand you're writing reviews for Publishers Weekly, right?
Right. I've been doing it, I guess, since I retired in 2019. It's a writing exercise. It's limited to, I usually turn in between 200 and 220 words. Wow. And again, it's not the kind of critical review that I would prefer to do because they're selling the book. That's the purpose of that review.
Okay.
But what I have done is I've managed to usually include something that I think may be a stopper or something to watch for a certain kind of cook. Like I'll say, this requires an extensive pantry, extensive Indian pantry. And if you've already got that going, then you're way ahead of the game. Or if there are cooking terms, there was one book I can't think of the name of now, but I reviewed a couple of years ago that I was stumbling over a couple of the terms and techniques that they were using. And I just said, this may be new to even the most experienced cook, but they're not really interested in that kind of critical thinking that I was referring to before. That said, the reason why I do it is because I get to see all the new stuff coming out that I, first of all, don't have any room for in my downsized apartment. And second of all, it's all in PDFs. Every once in a great while, I'll actually test to see if it reaffirms what I was thinking about a particular recipe. But most of the time, I have a pretty good handle on whether or not they've hit certain markers.
I love that you said it's a writing exercise, because to communicate anything in that few words is a writing exercise. So you're keeping yourself honed there. But the markers of a book. So in book criticism, what are the markers of a good cookbook?
I force myself to always read through the introduction and all the front material, because I think whether or not other people read it, that's where they're really laying it on the line. If I read too many times that it's my favorite, that it's the go-to, that I just want to make it accessible for everybody, I'm like, I've been there. I want to see a spark of something that you're going to show me or teach me. For me, it's the kitchen experience. No matter what the heck I'm doing, I'm learning something. I'm either learning to do it or not to do it ever again in my whole life, And when I'm skimming through the rest of the book, whether or not they actually fulfill that promise. I also, I have to say, since I'm in the recipe testing biz, look at the acknowledgments and I see if they mentioned how they test. Sometimes it's a big, long list of contributors, and, whether or not people list a big, long list of people, or if they've just got one go-to, like Dory Greenspan has her Mary Dodd. Mm-hmm. I know that they're very good about using ingredients that most people can get their hands on, but that sort of thing where accessibility and ease of use, and I just like seeing behind the door a little bit, and I like for people to give credit for that kind of thing. And then some people really are not still getting a whole lot of other people to test their recipes. And that crops up in various books from time to time.
Right. One question before we let you go is I wanted to know just how books come across your radar, because there seems to be every single year, and I know this can't be true, but it feels that way, that every year there's more cookbooks that come out. The spring cookbook year keeps growing. The fall cookbook year keeps growing. Actually, there's no season anymore. They just keep coming out all year round. So how do you find those books that you are going to give some time and attention to?
Well, I don't know if it's because of my Publishers Weekly status or a login access, but I do get to see anytime anybody signs a book with a publisher. I am blessed to be befriended by the Eckes group, Sally, and before that, Lisa, and they have been very kind to me. They've recommended several collaborations, or they've volunteered me, put up my name for recipe testing, and I'm very grateful for that. But they put me in touch with some people who handle self-published cookbooks and packagers, they're called. It might be an interesting thing for your show to interview somebody like that. Friends of mine did a Flavors of the Maghreb. They asked me to write a blurb for, and they're great recipes, very interesting, and it's interlinked cookbooks, I think. But before that, they were going to be self-published, and we're really going through the paces, trying to get it out there for people. So so much of that marketing and promotion now is in the hands of the author and responsible for what you do. Even big publishing houses are sort of cut off as a couple of weeks, and after that, you're on your own, and not what it used to be. I try to keep an eye out, and I'm still really fortunate to be plugged in with, various community groups and constituencies who are thinking about getting a cookbook together, or, just run something by me as a, what if Eleanor Roosevelt could fly kind of question. And I'm happy to, say, well, I'll just keep that in my head for a while and see if that percolates into anything. So,
well, you've mentioned, I know you say you retired from the Post, but you're clearly not retired from the cookbook industry, just listening to between your writing cookbook reviews as well as your freelance editing and your freelance recipe testing, it sounds like you're still very much in the game and keeping yourself very engaged in cookbooks, which is great.
Definitely a game with a small G. I mean, I'm really only doing a few projects a year. I retired in part because I thought I could travel, and then COVID hit. So now I'm booking all kinds of miles tickets and seeing where I can go and spending time with my family. So.
Well, it's been a delight to talk with you today on Everything Cookbooks. I've definitely have some things I want to keep in mind, especially with sub recipes, because I can't escape them. And a current project I'm working on is probably going to demand a lot of sub recipes. And now I've got some useful tidbits. And there's a whole lot more that we learned by picking your brain today, Bonnie. So thanks so much for joining us.
I'm in awe of all you guys, and Andrea too. I'm really happy that this podcast exists, and I'm thrilled to be on it.
Well, thanks for your support and for coming on. It's great to see you.
Thank you for listening to Everything Cookbooks. For more episodes and ways to contact us, go to our website, everythingcookbooks.com. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcast or wherever you get your audio. If you like what you hear, please leave us a review. It helps more people find the show. Any book mentioned on the show can be found on our affiliate page at bookshop.org. Thanks, as always, to our wonderful editor, Abby Cirquitella. And until next time, keep on reading, writing, and cooking.